As a long-term partner of the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, it is our pleasure here at the HKW to provide once again a public space for this challenging but all the more crucial debate. In 2014, the topic that we hosted here was titled Climate Politics at the Crossroads, while tonight's panel, it is on climate engineering in the wake of Paris. On the one hand, this shows how the international political circumstances have changed and how in these altered conditions, climate policy has to resituate itself. As you all know, the director of the US Environmental Protection Agency just yesterday announced his plan to repeal the cornerstone of Obama's era climate policy. This, on the other hand, shows the need and the relevance of intra-institutional collaborations, such as the one between the IASS and the HKW, that go beyond the political stratum. Since 2013, our two institutions have been working together on the critical situation we find ourselves in with a range of different initiatives. Within the Anthropocene Project and its continuations in the form of the long-term Anthropocene Curriculum Project and now the Anthropocene Lectures, we together worked on establishing frameworks and formats that help to transform the ways in which we all are engaged in research, education, arts, and civil society. I now welcome very much IASS Director, Professor Mark Lawrence. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Bernd, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the IASS and our other partners also, especially the House of World Cultures, who is partnering with us for the second time in organizing the Climate Engineering Conference 2017. They partnered with us already in 2014, as well as our other partners, the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, the C2G2, which one of the panelists is Janos Pastor, the leader of that initiative, and the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative, the SRMGI. It's a great pleasure to be back here at the House of World Cultures for this public event, which comes at a very critical point in time, as does the CEC17, the Climate Engineering Conference in 2017. As you very well know, 2 years ago, the Paris Agreement was reached, this agreement that we would try as an international community unanimously to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius and make efforts to keep it even below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The agreement that was ratified in record time. You're going to be hearing plenty more about that in the context from the panel. Well, this effort, especially pushing the threshold down to explicitly talking about 1.5 degrees, has also pushed forward the discussions about what we call climate engineering, both the types of measures that are included in that, carbon dioxide removal, getting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere faster than it's removed naturally, and the various techniques that fall under what we call solar radiation management, ideas to increase the amount of sunlight that's reflected back to space. Now, you can imagine, if you're from the public and you hear about this for the first time, you can imagine these are probably controversial topics, and in fact, they are. And for a controversial topic like that, it needs a debate, not only among scientists and policymakers, but amongst various members of the society. We need to involve a variety of scientific disciplines so that we get a holistic perspective on this, not only the engineering and natural sciences, but also political sciences, philosophy, law, and so on. And we need to involve groups from society, policymakers, environmental groups, even religious groups in this debate. And this is where the CEC17 comes in. We've brought together a number of these different perspectives in a forum for critical, global, and transparent discussions. The CEC17 is taking place over 4 days with over 250 participants from over 30 countries from this wide range of backgrounds. And we're very glad to again have the opportunity with the House of World Cultures to include into this largely scientific, what we call transdisciplinary, going beyond the bounds of academic science to bring in a breadth of perspectives into the conference itself, to include within the framework of the conference this public event, an opportunity to bring this to a larger group of people for a larger discussion. This is how I'd like to mention one of the many public events that our institute and the House of World Cultures and many other institutes of the partners, some of those who you will see on stage this evening, organize to try to communicate about this topic with the broader public. So that said, I'd like to wish you all a very interesting and a very enjoyable evening.
Thank you, Mark. I too would like to welcome you on no institutional basis whatsoever, but just in my own capacity as this evening's chair and speaking for my 6 colleagues who are going to provide you with information, entertainment, and challenging views over the next hour and a half. And if you guys could come up onto the stage in preparation for that task, I'd much appreciate it. It's an interesting word. We're meeting here in the wake of Paris. An interesting word, wake. In that ocean liners have them, so of course do funerals. No, you can't sit there, Pablo, that's where I'm sitting. And we're going to make out whether we are seeing some sort of like great progress across the oceans or something else over the course of the evening. We have an excellent panel of 6 speakers, and we're going to go through this on the basis we're going to have 3 little sort of like mini sessions. One, we're going to talk about Paris itself, what it means, how we set it within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, how it fits in the broader context of climate diplomacy and the progress and lack of progress that we've seen in that field. And we'll have a couple of presentations of that, then we'll have a little bit of chat on the panel about that. Then we're going to look at the specific numerical targets that were set in Paris. Again, a couple of presentations and some back and forth. And then we will have 2 more presentations on a larger context. What goals do we actually want from climate discussions? What is the broader context in which we wish to place them? And after that, I'm going to ask you all to do your bit by posing challenging and difficult questions to the panelists, who will, of course, have been taking it very easy on each other up until that point. I'd remind the panelists and you, I suppose, that though this event happens in the context of CEC17, this isn't truly a part of CEC17. You will notice that there are indeed some among you who aren't wearing name badges and are in fact members of the public. And you're very welcome, particularly welcome. And I would ask the panelists to remember that this is not necessarily a discussion by experts for experts. This isn't a discussion where we attempt to, while grounded in expertise, move beyond that and, in the phrase of some friends of mine on the west coast of America, achieve disagreement at the highest level possible. The members of the panel will not all agree on things, and you will certainly not agree with all of them. The idea is to find ways, through probing each other's arguments and welcoming each other's arguments, to understand fundamentally where and why people disagree on these subjects, rather than try to win people over or to just talk past each other. So with that in mind, I'd like to, I think we're probably all happy sitting down, aren't we? Yes? Yes? General sitting down sort of feeling? Yeah, good. I would actually ask, first, I would ask Liz to speak to us. Liz Thompson was the executive chair of the Rio +20 conference. She's been a member of parliament, a minister and a senator in Barbados. She's been active in sustainable development for quite a long time. And she's a practicing lawyer and consultant. So Liz, if you could start us off, and then after Liz, I'll go straight on. We'll hear from Janusz Pastor, who probably is known to many of you. Janusz was, until fairly recently, the Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change in New York. He is now running C2G2, as it's known to wonks and Star Wars fans, which is the Carnegie Climate Geoengineering Governance Initiative. So those two will kick us off, and then the panel will talk a bit, and then we'll move on to the numbers. Thanks very much.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Oliver. I must confess that I was quite relaxed when Oliver said, and Liz, you start. I'm pleased to have been invited and to be sitting with such a distinguished panel. And I should like to make some comments from the perspective of small island developing states, because clearly that is the background from which I come. And because small island developing states are on the front line of climate change impacts and the adverse effects of climate change. Within the last month, around 20 islands in the Caribbean have been seriously impacted by a number of hurricanes, 2 of which were Category 5s. Remember that Sandy, which devastated the eastern seaboard of the United States about 4 years ago, was a Category 3 hurricane. And that when Irma hit the US, when the other one, Maria, hit the US, they both hit the US at Category 3. But that the islands of the Caribbean took the pounding of 170 miles an hour winds. Islands that are less than 430 square kilometers in size. So for us, climate change is not a hoax by the Chinese, as we've heard from the President of the US. It isn't something that may happen down the road. It is something that you walk down the beach and see every morning when the coastline is gone. It is something that you see every day of your life and experience in the increasing heats, with the number and the intensity of extreme weather events. And I want to make the point that since 2000, there have been more than 20 severe hurricanes impacting the Caribbean. 10 of them were Category 5s. Full 50% of them were Category 5s. So for us in the region, this is about survival, and that's why the slogan 1.5 to stay alive, and that is why in the context of the multilateral negotiations, the island states of the Pacific, of Africa, and of the Caribbean in particular have been vociferous and insistent that we meet the 2-degree target or that we try to fall below it. I want then to locate where we are in relation to SRM initiatives, and then to put this in the context of the SDGs and the broader development initiatives and strategy. There is no dialogue in the Caribbean at the policy level about SRM. Nobody has located it in the context of an option for climate control or done any sort of cost-benefit analysis to determine if this is an option that islands would want. And if in fact it is to be an option, who will own the technologies? What will be their impacts? What level of access would island nations have? Where would island scientists be located in the conversation? What degree of power will there be? Are there going to be conventions and instruments similar to what exists within the UN system? And how will these instruments be negotiated? By whom? What ranking will be given to states as these negotiation processes evolve? Those are the kinds of questions the island states would want to ask. Because if this is an instrument which is going to impact us, if solar radiation management is going to be part of the option which we evaluate when we look at tools for climate engineering and for climate impacts and for adaptation and mitigation, then to what extent are there going to be controls? To what extent will there be access? To what extent is there going to be a level of deployment that will impact on us, and what say will we have in that process? At the moment, the consideration of the islands would be finance. What will it cost to employ and deploy such technologies? Clearly, this is a matter of great concern to countries which have been devastated, and when I say devastated, I do not use the word lightly. 95% of housing in Dominica is flattened, or people have lost their roofs. Barbuda has had to have been evacuated altogether for the first time, and I think they're saying 300 years. There is nobody living on Barbuda because it can no longer sustain life, and that has happened in the last month. St. Martin, St. Eustatius, Martinique, I could go down the list of islands all across the Caribbean that now have lost their economies, their quality of life, where people are living in the dark every day and have been unable to get a hot meal since Irma and Maria hit the Caribbean. So the question is finance. If you are asking us to meet an international obligation called the SDGs, which are far more complex, multi-tiered, have significant more targets than the MDGs that did, how do you do it when really you have a devastated island state? Where are the resources to come from? And therefore, what priority do you give to technologies of this sort, or issues which are going to be considered by many as esoteric and by a population that has strong religious beliefs as the level of manipulation which is perhaps flying in the face of God? And these are the kinds of arguments that island politicians are going to have to face when they seek to discuss the issues with populations. At the same time, however, there has not been up to this point any attempt to engage the political directorate of the island states that are most impacted by climate change. And yet, this is a climate engineering technology of which we are speaking. Those people who are most impacted by climate have not been involved in the dialogue up to now. So will we be able to use partnerships, as the SDGs provide for, to look at the deployment of this technology? I spoke to the issue of funding. There has been, in the international system, when we are talking about finance, in recent times, a dialogue around, I hate it when this happens, I'm forgetting the expression that is used all the time now. But, sorry? No. I was talking about in the context of financing, where the push has been toward self-financing of development, and therefore there's been a concentration on maximizing your tax streams and ensuring that the private sector gets involved in development. And this is not an option in the context of small island developing states for two reasons. If your population is 150,000 people, then your working population is probably half of that. So there is no significant tax pool to speak about. And you are talking in the context of the islands about micro businesses as opposed to even small and medium enterprises. So they cannot finance the kind of boot and bolt operations that are so widely talked about nowadays. So the islands now come, and I'm going to conclude here because I imagine that I'll be able to make other points as we go along. The point, therefore, that I'm seeking to make is climate change is critical for the islands, mitigation and adaptation. But there has been no dialogue which allows us to identify SRM as being available to us or accessible. In the context then of the international negotiations and the international conversation, how do we access it? Where are issues of finance? How do we rank it in the context of the SDGs, which are already very complex in a situation in which many countries in the region have been graduated from concessionary finance, where GDP is far below your debt to GDP ratio is very high, and where already islands which are tourist destinations are devastated in the wake of serious weather events, extreme weather events. For the Caribbean, perhaps SRM, but at this stage, we don't know.
Thank you very much indeed. Janos.
Thank you, Oliver. And when you asked me to participate in this panel, you asked me to try to say a few words about the overall context in terms of the Paris Agreement, and I will do that. But now, this evening, when you introduced us, you also talked about entertainment. And I'm not sure if I can do that, but I will do my best. First, just looking at Paris for a moment, let's see, in some ways, Liz, you've described all these issues in the Caribbean, and if these are related to climate change, which I think many of us would believe that that is the case, then let's see to what extent is Paris going to address these issues and how. So, first point on Paris is that, for me, there are two really important outcomes of Paris that we need to consider, relevant in general, but relevant in particular for our discussions on geoengineering. The first is, of course, the goal, the temperature goal that was set there. And just to recall again, it is well below 2 degrees centigrade, and if possible, 1.5. So that small range of 1.5 to well below 2 degrees is what we're aiming for. And the second one is that the emissions need to balance by mid-century with the sinks. And that is basically to reach the net zero by that period of time. Now, these two goals have actually very strong impact on geoengineering, both of them, at least potentially, if not in practice. First, because to reach the net zero, you need to start removing carbon from the atmosphere at some point in time. And whether that's this year or in 20 years from now or 25 years from now, there are discussions going on, and that's a detail, but the fact is that at some point that has to start. And the other one, the temperature goal, is that if we're not meeting that temperature goal, we're going to get higher and higher and higher, and already 1 degree, which is where we are now roughly, is a problem. And we can talk a lot about those problems. What will a world look like which is 2 degrees above historical? I think it will be terrible, let alone 3 and 4 degrees that might come if we don't do what we have to do. So and that's where potentially the other geoengineering technology may come in, as some scientists would tell us, solar geoengineering. So both of those goals that came out of Paris have particular relevance. Yet, the post-Paris process in terms of the formal negotiations has been largely focused on basically one issue, mitigation, reduction of emissions, which of course it has to, because that is the #1 priority that we must do. But there are other things that need to be done. Now, we often forget that Paris was the big deal, of course. There were thousands of people, and there were 155 heads of states who came, and all these incredible things, and yes, very important. But in that same year, we had the agreement on the Agenda for Sustainable Development in 2030 with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And while that agreement is not hard law like the treaty, the Paris Agreement, it is an extremely important agreement that has a lot more to do with implementing the Paris Agreement than some people would like to believe. Why do I say that? Because, first of all, the Sustainable Development Goals collectively provide the overall framework in which action needs to take place. There is a goal on climate change, Goal 13, but in fact that's almost irrelevant, that goal. The real way to achieve the Paris Agreement is to implement all the other Sustainable Development Goals on oceans, on forestry, on eradication of poverty, on education, on all those different aspects. That is what is going to help us to achieve the Paris Agreement. So the interrelationship between these two agreements is extremely important. You cannot implement the Paris Agreement without implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, and vice versa. There's no way you're going to reach the Sustainable Development Goals if you don't reach the Paris Agreement That is to say the 1.5 to 2 degree range temperature. Because if you're going to have a 4 or 5 degree world, you can kiss goodbye to all the SDGs. That's as simple as that. So the relationship between these two in terms of the overall framework must be re-emphasized. And for those of you who were at the session this afternoon, there was some discussion about research and where the research should go. And at some point somebody said we need some kind of an overall agreement of where the world needs to go, and we have it. This is the Agenda for Sustainable Development for 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Now let's use that and let's try to build these different activities into that. Now, just very briefly on another important component of the Paris Conference, which is linked to this, is the national plans that countries brought to Paris to demonstrate what they can do to reduce their emissions. They have an acronym, everything in climate change is an acronym, NDCs, for Nationally Determined Contributions. What it is basically bottom-up national plans for reduction of emissions and for adaptation and related activities. Now, what is important is that the plans that countries brought to Paris in 2015 in totality are insufficient to reach the targets set in Paris. If all the plans that were put on the table are implemented 100%, experts will say that it will be somewhere between 2.7 to 3.5 degrees warming above historical average. It's way above of what is acceptable and way above what the Paris Agreement itself desires. But that's where we come into another important element of the Paris Agreement, and that's the mechanism that was agreed to ratchet up the ambition over time. Every 5 years there will be an event where countries will come together and discuss their mitigation actions and hopefully agree to increase the ambition level. The first one of these will be next year in something called a facilitated dialogue, and we do hope that there will be a proper discussion and it will result in raising the ambition level, because if it does not, then we are in even bigger trouble than we think. And to close, I'd like to leave it at that for now, just 3 very quick points on the overall Paris process. Some people have asked, is this the end of a 25-year negotiation process, or is this the beginning of something else? My sense is clear that it is the beginning of a new phase, a new approach to managing climate risks, and let's hope that it will be a little bit more successful than the previous 25 years. The second is which I've mentioned again, but I think that the Paris Agreement is key for the geoengineering discussion that we've been having at this conference, both in terms of removals, but also in terms of managing the temperature goal one way or another. And finally, the 3 things that are really making Paris fundamentally different from the previous agreements. One is that there was an extremely high level and strong political support from all countries to come into Paris, negotiate an agreement, and within less than a year have the agreement ratified in all the countries so that it could enter into force. Amazing. Unfortunately, that political support that was expressed by 150, I don't know how many leaders, was not translated into the same level of political support at the domestic level for those issues. So that's something to remember. The second is that at a time when everybody said multilateralism, forget it, that's the past. And at that time, it was possible to arrive at a multilateral agreement in a multilateral framework. I think that's a very big success. And the third thing which is different, and that's quite important too, particularly when it comes to specific actions of countries, this is the first time that the international community has tried a quote-unquote bottom-up approach. There are no requirements for how much each country should reduce. It's every country who decides for itself, bottom-up. This is what I think I can do, this is what I will do. And we'll see how that works. The jury's out. But that's what we have. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So do we have any quick points on either of those presentations from the other panelists? Lily?
right? Yes.
Ask them. Is it on?
Yes, thank you. Hello, I'm Lily Foy. I work for the Heinrich Böll Stiftung here in Berlin. And I just want to stress one point, so we're all very clear on that. I think you said it, but I just want to highlight that. Governments in Paris, with the Paris Agreement, did not negotiate geoengineering in Paris. And assuming that they did, that they did talk about geoengineering would actually, in my view, undermine the careful balance of trust that was struck in Paris. So there is no language, in my view, in the Paris Agreement that actively encourages the idea of climate geoengineering. But there is one other forum, a UN forum, a very important one, a sister convention to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the one that looks at biodiversity, the UN's CBD, that convention, that has discussed geoengineering for many, many years. And after many, many years, in 2010, came to a consensus conclusion, a decision that translates into a de facto moratorium on geoengineering technologies. So I just want to immediately, right at the start of our conversation here tonight, encourage us to pull this discussion on geoengineering out of the climate bubble and look at all of the broader implications of a potential use and discussion of this technology.
Thanks very much, Rudy. Janos, putting your governance hat on, do you read the CBD discussions as a moratorium? Take that one. I'm going to keep this one for a while.
Okay. So the content of the CBD decision is very clearly that. It describes under what conditions climate geoengineering activities should or should not take place. So that's pretty important. And I don't think you can argue too much about that. Where there is a question where some people call it de facto moratorium, others call it something like a moratorium, is the operative paragraph that is there on top of that decision. And that is to say that it suggests to countries that countries may wish to take into account the following guidance. So if it were a decision that said countries must, then I would agree that would be a moratorium. But because it says countries may wish to take into account the following guidance, the content is like a moratorium, but in fact it is not operatively that. But at the same time, if I may just to make one more comment there, I think it's really important what Lily said, that there are many other processes where the issue of geoengineering has come up formally. CBD is one of them. The London Convention, London Protocol is another one, where very concrete actions have been taken. And other areas where actually the discussion about these issues might come up much faster than in the formal UNFCCC process itself. So that is a very important comment that I certainly subscribe to myself.
Liz, I think you wanted to come back in.
I wanted to ask Janos a question based on the comment about political support at the high level not translating into domestic support on what was happening on the ground. And my question to you, Janos, is the issue therefore not one of architecture, that we have these international discussions at the macro level, but we do not look at the architecture for implementation, and therefore there is a disconnect between what is negotiated internationally and what can be delivered at the domestic level, because the issue of architecture is not addressed at all?
I think we can spend a lot of time on this, but I would just quickly respond that it is partly that, I agree with you, but even an agreement on the kind of architecture that you're alluding to would need a kind of political support at the domestic level that we don't have. That's the reality. So interesting, there are some countries that have gone back and without necessarily mentioning too many countries on an individual basis, but there are countries that have gone back and they have created legally binding requirements in their countries to actually reach a certain level of emission reduction. But that's fantastic. But there are not too many of those, less than on my one hand, that's the problem. So, what I would hope to see at some point is that the leaders who were so loud and so clearly committed at the political level to engage, to discuss, to bring it for the agreement domestically for entry into force, that they then go and translate it into local laws and regulations so that things actually can happen.
Great. I think we'll move on to the next pairing now and talk actually about the temperature goals of Paris and what they mean for us. And to talk about this, we have David Keith and Oliver Gedd. And David is a professor at Harvard, where he is setting up an interfaculty group on geoengineering. He's worked on a large number of physics issues, but has been working for at least 25 years on climate and energy issues, including policy issues. He is also the founder of a company called Carbon Engineering, which works on direct air capture technologies. Oliver is, I learned to my delight, by academic background, a cultural anthropologist. But he has fallen among policymakers, and he is now head of the research division of the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, SWP, which is the German Institute for International Security Affairs. He's also been seconded to Germany's Germany's Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy on various occasions, I believe. So, David and Oliver, I think, David, if you could go first, talk to us a little bit about the Paris goals and how you see them impacting the geoengineering debate.
A lot and not much at the same time. I mean, I want to agree
fine.
with
Next.
I want to agree with Lily that there wasn't much discussion in Paris, and that it would be wrong to read the agreement as somehow mandating geoengineering. So it's tempting to say that if you literally take the 1.5 degree target, let's say, or close to it, that since in practice, if you just read that literally, it actually is true that use of solar geoengineering would likely make it much easier to get there, that somehow it's mandated by Paris. But I think that would really be misreading, really wrong in terms of the actual intent of the decisions. I guess I'd comment on the temperature targets in two ways. One is to say that I think these two different kinds of geoengineering that have been talked about here have very different roles to play. So up until emissions are headed down towards zero, I can't see much distinction between things that reduce emissions and carbon removal. That is, I think that they just should compete against each other to see which is more effective, cost-effective, or environmentally effective, or socially effective. But from my point of view, I don't see much justification for kind of special attention to carbon removal until emissions are well on their way towards zero. And I said that even as somebody who helped to found a company that works on carbon removal, but to be clear, we work on it as a way to make aviation fuels from sunlight, which we think is a kind of mitigation. But I think that there's a great deal of overhype about the potential role of carbon removal, and that overhype is really there because people in integrated assessment models, so models that attempt to incorporate the whole economy and human decision-making, those models have been kind of twisted and tortured to make them show that we can get to 1.5, but not violate a bunch of rules that were written inside the models, and so they've produced an enormous amount of carbon removal, but that's not based on any bottom-up serious assessment of the practicality of that, of the environmental costs of that, of the social impacts of doing so. So I think the way I would say it is that carbon removal is what could help the world, if we wanted to do it, to reduce the very long-run impacts of the emissions that we have already done. Because it's important to say that even if we eliminate emissions today, we don't make the climate problem go away, we just make it stop getting worse. And so carbon removal is something that allows a long-term reduction of the human impact on climate. SRM, solar geoengineering, has, I think, a kind of opposite thing. Solar geoengineering could, not should, but appears to be able to reduce the peak amount of climate change, reduce the peak temperature, if you like. And I think the debate is about whether or not, at this point, there should be a serious research effort to understand better how well it might do that, what its risks might be, what are the ways it might go wrong, and what are the ways that it might be governed.
Fine. Oliver.
So coming to the temperature targets, I think it well below 2 degrees and 1.5, of course, have accelerated that discourse of CDR and SRM. There has been some debate on CDR before Paris, That's basically because the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report in 2013-14, the mitigation part is not based, but includes a lot of negative emissions, around 600 gigatons in the 21st century, which amounts to 15 years of today's annual CO2 emissions. So that's really a lot. And in a way, policymakers have, you could say, ordered that kind of feature years ago, and the IPCC and the modeling groups behind it put that into their models to be able to show that a 2 degrees target, which is really ambitious, if you look at our pathway or at our trajectory, to meet that kind of target. But policymakers never picked that up. So they just don't want to discuss it, because we talk a lot about policy, about evidence-based policy making, but the usual standard mode is more policy-based evidence making. So policymakers don't derive their programs from scientific knowledge and say, okay, yeah, we just now have to do that. They fight for their policy proposals. You have lots of instrument constituencies that have their pet policy proposal and try to attach it to certain problems. So of course there are some people that want CDR to be done or SRM to be done. They can use Paris as a hook. There are others who are concerned. They can at least say, okay, that's a problem that there's so much CDR in there. There are others like me say it's completely inconsistent. I understand why it is inconsistent, but at least I don't want to let policymakers off the hook with that, because it creates a kind of a fantasy world where we in Paris basically decide on an agreement and on national determined contributions that would mount up to 3.5 degrees, maybe, if we deliver on it, but at the same time put a label like 1.5 or 2 degrees on it. So there's a lot of hypocrisy going on. So I think there are several factions that have an interest to talk about CDR, but mainstream policymakers are not amongst them. So if you try in Germany, which claims itself to be a climate policy leader, to talk about it, they don't want to talk about it, because the technologies like bioenergy CCS, which is the main technology in the models, it's completely unattractive for a policymaker. You won't win elections on that. You will only feel the heat, so they just don't talk about it. And in a way, there's a huge mismatch about it. The one actor who in Europe could change that picture is the European Commission, who might, after the 1.5 degree special report in fall 2018, present a new roadmap until 2050, and there are signals that they want to get at least a little bit serious on negative emissions. But if you look at the models, actually, how they, let's say, distribute the burden of delivering negative emissions, because if you were to take it seriously, you would have to ask, okay, 600 gigatons, it has to be done, but who's actually going to do it? Probably the global climate policy leaders, or those with the highest historical emissions, would have to start. And to come up with numbers like 50 gigatons negative emissions for the European Union, that again is more than 10 times of today's annual emissions. So it's a kind of a fantasy world right now, because policymakers don't pick it up in any way. And I don't have any idea where it will go during the next years, but it's not a real policymaking discussion. SRM, of course, you won't find a policymaker that doesn't want to talk about research right now. But you could say they have not talked about it in Paris because they simply, for several other reasons, picked these targets. I find it more interesting how the 2 degree target went, because in Copenhagen we called it 2 degree target. In Cancun a year later it was below 2 degree. Now it's well below 2 degree. But the actions are not matching that. So we're not doing much, but we find it interesting or find it useful to have ever more ambitious target and work on the vocabulary.
It's like the numbers on the amplifier and Spinal Tap. You can change the numbers, but you can't change the volume. Pablo, did you want to comment on that?
He wanted to
Yes, I know he wanted to, but I was actually, you were holding a microphone in a way that suggested you wanted to use it.
I want to use it.
Then you use it first, and then we'll go to David. Talk into the top of... I'm sorry.
Let's see this
There
work.
we
All
go.
right, there you go.
Yep.
So, first the chair situation, then the microphone situation. You can tell that my perception of what is my place and how to relate to technology may need more sharpening. Thanks for this. This is very good. I want to pick up on this fantasy world, and especially evidence-based policy versus policy-based evidence. It is absolutely crucial for us to recognize that who we have here is not only in that room, but in our event and in these conversations, people who are genuinely concerned about what's going on, honestly, and in my opinion, full of integrity, dedicated to understanding and addressing the problem. A concern we should all have is that once this becomes more plausible, once this becomes more within reach, once this becomes more like a battleground that you have to show up if you want to be respected, then we will also have, I predict, a much larger proportion of people who will invoke desirable goals, but have not only those goals, but also alternative, less visible, less shareable intentions and motivations. And I don't know how we are going to deal with that. I am very happy that the events so far, including some events in this venue a few years ago, are bringing in people from the spiritual and religious universe, people from the arts, people from philosophy. It's well transcended the atmospheric science and policy. And those interesting questions that put us in a new place need more prominent place as things evolve the way they are evolving.
David, you wanted to make a point?
Yeah, two examples of this sort of fantasy disconnect. One for carbon removal and one for solar geo. So for carbon removal, there's enormous talk now about direct air capture. And my phone rings off the hook. There are about 60 employees between the company I founded Carbon Engineering and Climeworks. That's less employees than a tiny little company developing part of the mechanical drive system for one particular variant of a north-south axis tilted solar plant. Like, it's nobody. The right answer for the policy world is just forget about it until something real has happened. And on solar geoengineering, there's this weird disconnect where it's actually almost a scientific certainty that you could use it to achieve a given temperature target. So if you wanted to achieve 1.5 with confidence, solar geo is perhaps the only way to be really sure of doing that with very high probability. But that's kind of a trick, because what it shows to you is that these temperature targets are just proxies for all sorts of things we really care about. Nobody feels the global average temperature. They feel whether there's a hurricane nearby, how the crops grow, whether there's high temperatures that kill them, whether there's big rainfalls. And what we don't know well enough is how solar geoengineering, a combination of that and emissions cuts, would actually address those things. So solar geoengineering measured on this metric of just global temperature looks perfect, which is nonsense. And I think it kind of speaks to the disconnect around the metrics we use, the technocratic metrics we use to talk about manipulating our shared climate.
Yeah.
Just to follow on that line, I think that brings us to a very important point, that why is it so crazy, and why are some people suggesting certain things? And I would suggest that one of the reasons is that so far the discussion about these technologies has been not completely, but largely only restricted to a small set of scientists. And there's nothing wrong with scientists. I'm one of them too, so I was one of them anyway. But it is something that society at large needs to address, so that you can bring in these different aspects, whether it's the health, whether it's the migration, whether it's the food issue, whether it's the extra deaths that are happening today in those cities that are having the extreme heat that is way beyond the sort of the averages that we're talking about here. Those are the things that matter, and those people, the people who understand those issues, those people who get hurt in those issues, they need to be engaged in that conversation. And I think that's, to me, this is the next major step, is to have those societal discussions, bringing in the different stakeholders so we can move forward.
Oliver, with your forbearance, I'm going to move on to the next bit of the discussion, because that seems like such a lovely way into it. Thank you very much, Janusz, for doing my job for me. I know the last bit of our discussion we're going to hear from people we've already heard from Lily Fura and from Pablo Suarez. Lily is the head of sustainable development and ecology at the Heinrich Böll Foundation, is also on the board of the Etc. group. She's worked on geoengineering in the context of the COPs, including COP21. She's also the author of Inside the Green Economy, Promises and Pitfalls. Pablo works at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, though he will be wanting to tell you that he does not speak on their behalf. He is Associate Director for Research and for Innovation, and I can tell you from personal experience, he's very good at research and very, very good at innovation. He's a visiting fellow at Boston University and works, among other things, as some of you will have learned this afternoon, on the application of games to learning and idea development in these sort of areas. So Lily first, and then Pablo, and then we'll be opening up to questions. Lily.
Thank you very much. So at the Heinrich Böll Foundation, with our network of partners in civil societies, we believe that geoengineering should not be on the table for addressing climate change. And what I want to do in my very few minutes here is actually try and respond to your challenge, Oliver, to try hard to explain and try and understand for myself why we disagree with a number of people in this room. And I want to start with a quote from Vandana Shiva. She has said, "The problem is not the sun, the problem are greedy men on planet Earth." And I think even though we all talk about climate change and we all call it climate change, I think maybe we mean different things. So what exactly is the problem that we're trying to solve? And I think before we've agreed on that, it will be difficult to actually agree on ways to addressing that problem. So we need to go back to the original problem statement and try and paint something that Wolfgang Sachs, a German thinker in ecology, has called the history of forgotten alternatives, and I quite like that phrase. So back in 1992, with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we, and even before that, but then certainly globally, we began to talk about climate change as this thing to do with emissions up there somewhere in the atmosphere. And that's one way of looking at climate change. And if that's how you look at climate change and talk about it, your set of solutions, your way of addressing that problem, will look at reducing those emissions. So you will eventually, in the course of climate policy making, that led us to quite a number of what we now call wrong and false solutions, including offsetting emission reductions. And now we're talking about negative emissions. But there's a long history of how we've come to talk about that. But what if we understood climate change to be something else? What if we try and explain and describe climate change to be a problem of, and I'm just offering one perspective here, of unfair access and control over natural resources, climate change to be about the burning of fossil fuels, to be about industrial scale agriculture and the plundering of our home, Mother Earth. There are different ways of talking about it, but looking at climate change as being about emissions up there in the atmosphere is just one way, and we've taken a long road over the last few decades, and in my view, we've narrowed our vision and have narrowed down the potential solutions that we're even able to think about today. But that knowledge, that wide range of knowledge of different ways of thinking about it, different solutions, different types of science, different histories, all of that still exists, but it's going to go extinct, actually. We call it ecological epistemicide. We've written an essay about that. And that's quite a strong statement, but I think we risk losing all of that knowledge through this, very strong global discourse we're creating about carbon emissions and our carbon metric system. So, in my view, climate change is not an engineering problem, and it is and not and should never be just another tool in our toolbox to address climate change. You could also say, if geoengineering is the answer, maybe the question is the wrong one. And just to come back to Wolfgang Sachs, this German thinker I've mentioned before, many, many years ago, he talked about different perspectives that we can take when talking about ecology and sustainability. And he explicitly mentioned two different perspectives. One is the astronaut's perspective. It's this vision of a fragile planet Earth spinning around in space. It's the vision that we often see now in the climate change debate. You've all seen it, Blue Planet. It's one way of looking at this whole thing, but there's also a completely different perspective, and that is what Wolfgang Sachs called the livelihood perspective. It is one where you're deeply rooted in a given territory and consider yourself to be part of that ecosystem and nature. So for me, the vision of an engineered, climate-engineered planet is not one of care. It is one of military control, domination, and fear. And I hope that we can together do a little bit more of this exercise of telling the history of forgotten alternatives and trying to take a different perspective, basically zooming in again from out of space, from the astronaut's perspective, back into the livelihood perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, really. Pablo.
Thank you. So, starting with the disclosure, I am a member of a team called the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. We're a technical team. I'm in charge of research and innovation, and I am fortunate that I can spend my time here instead of dealing with everything that all my humanitarian colleagues have to do, which is a lot. Geoengineering is a very new topic. There isn't enough knowledge, enough positions, enough, etc. So I am speaking as myself and as a member of this small team. I am not, repeat, not speaking on behalf of the IFRC, the global family, the German Red Cross, or none of the above. Thanks for tolerating my personal views. So the key issue is that we, my colleagues who do both humanitarian work and science, we see the issue of geoengineering, the issue of the technological feasibility of deliberately manipulating the global climate as a humanitarian concern. Whether we do it or not, we know that we disaster managers, etc., have to be thinking about Murphy's Law. What can go wrong if we do? What can go wrong if we don't? And what should we do about it? And if we wait until it's imminent, by the time we show up to the conversation, it will be too late and decisions will be made. So I have to balance this, do I show up or not? There are other more urgent priorities. But because of FARIS, because of the text that is now available in 2 degrees or less, it is reinforcing the prospects of eventually someone somewhere saying, you know what, it's time to do it. And whether you want to call it a protective veil or you want to call it sulfur that blocks sunlight, language does matter, but consequences matter more to us. And to us, as David said today, and even more eloquently today in the press conference, 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, they're relevant simplifications for a conversation across nations. But what matters to us is people. What matters to us is, can we avert human suffering? And can we preserve human dignity? We as Red Cross also have to care for dignity. And guess what? If someone changes your climate, whether unintentionally, because there's emissions and your knowledge from generations of the seasons, of the wind coming from the north means good rain, your knowledge has been stolen. Yeah? In Antigua and Barbuda, there was a saying about hurricanes. June too soon, July stand by, August comes it most, September remember, October all over. I was working on disaster preparedness in Barbuda, helping understand hurricanes and climate, and guess what? This fellow was telling me, we have been robbed of our knowledge because hurricanes are coming into November and December. Imagine the loss of dignity that would happen if someone told you, you know what, I'm going to solve your problem by changing your climate. Trust me, I'm going to throw some magic dust up there. We don't know what will happen to them, and maybe it's best for their health, food security, etc. but dignity matters, and we have no idea how to manage this very complex subnational conversation that will change things. Now, if eventually the time comes, and it may come, that we're told to trust the magic dust and to act fast and to slow this warming, will it be better or will it be worse? The metric should not be degrees Celsius. The metric should be human well-being, avoiding suffering, and promoting dignity. We care for all these things, and when it comes to the question, what would be worse, to yes or no solar radiation management, as of now, based on what we know, the answer is we don't know, and also we know that it depends how much you do it, more on the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. It's complicated, it's very complex. But what we do know is that should we confront a runaway changing scenario or tipping points, then it is undeniable that solar radiation management may keep rising temperatures down. We know that. And we know that as a result, many, I don't know what proportion of humans would probably be better off. What we don't know is a lot that matters to us. So how can we do that evaluation knowing that if we get to that point, the decisions are unlikely to be made based on the voices of the most vulnerable, the very people who have not contributed much to causing the problem, the ones who are increasingly more in trouble. They're homeless in Barbuda, they are going to be homeless in Bangladesh, and so on. What can we do to ensure that the policy processes elicit their voices and their understanding, considers their preferences and positions, and addresses their needs? It is, 7 to 10 billion people we're talking about. I really don't have a solution, but I know that we need to be asking that question. Questions do matter. Language does matter. Just a minor reflection, if I may. Today we had a game session where there was a 6-sided die. A 6 is a flood, a 1 is a drought. You roll it, you get in trouble or not, you may prepare more for it or not. And then we introduced some changes. It was becoming weird, the climate. And then the choice of geoengineering in the form of an electric knife, that you can cut chunks of the dice to augment or reduce the probability of certain things. It got violent, my friends. And this was a bunch of people that already liked and even loved each other. But it got intense. And I must say I have an emotional turbulence within me because of what happened today. Very big thanks to those of you who were in that session. So there is a lot we need to learn about the role of emotions, the role of egos, the role of love, and the role of everything else that I shall not mention but is in your minds on what are we going to be thinking and what are we going to be doing. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Yes, don't bring a knife to a policy fight. That's what I always say. Is there anyone else from on the panel who'd like to respond on either of those points, particularly these viewpoints of dignity and livelihood, which neither word came up earlier in our discussion? Anything from anyone else on the panel before I move it open to the...
To respond briefly on the idea of the technical fix, the idea that you should just trust the fairy dust, because that characterization of the way people like me are thinking is crucial to how we think about it. No complicated problem like this has a single cause. So are there lots of greedy men? Do they cause trouble? Of course, as they have presumably since there were men. Can we do better? Yes, in some ways we maybe even have done marginally better over my life. But the idea that there's a single unitary cause is a distortion of the real problems we face. And I think you can't view the climate problem that way and get anywhere. I don't know anybody working seriously on climate who thinks there's a pure technological problem with a technological engineering solution. When I began to work on this problem in the late 80s, I worked mostly with the environmental community. People talked about social problems and injustice from the beginning. That's the core of one of the threads that caused the problem. But it would also be wrong to imagine these problems were purely a product of, say, the capitalistic modern age. The fact is, humans have had environmental consequences forever. And long, long before there were the modern structures, we had enormous, horrific environmental consequences. In many ways, the product of science and technology has been helping us learn how to do better and also worse with the environment. But the idea that somehow some past world magically dealt with these problems better just flies in the face of anybody who knows environmental history. And I think this problem is hard. There are no pure engineering solutions. But likewise, it isn't just, I would submit, about male greed. I think there also is actually such a thing as carbon emissions, and the scientific knowledge of their accumulation and consequences is a useful product of the human mind, studying the way nature works, and the warning about the effect of all those emissions in changing our climate, and the different ways we can manage with it are human products with human jealousies and rivalries that matter. And you can't abstract this to either extreme. It's not a pure engineering problem, but it's not just a problem you can settle by having a wonderfully a just society, because just societies might be just as polluting.
Janos, you wanted to come in?
Yes. Very briefly, I was very much taken by this history of forgotten alternatives, and I like this because I've been part of this. I've been working on this topic for 40 years now, and I've seen many of these, so I share that with you. But what I wanted to say, without getting into a very big philosophical discussion, that in my view, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, is in a sense the response of the intergovernmental thinking to that problem. Because it doesn't address it completely. Of course it doesn't. But you know, in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is a king. And I think that the SDGs actually try to look at the totality, the way you refer to Mother Earth. And it does, to a very large extent, tries to do that. And the last point I wanted to make is that, yes, there is discussion in there about livelihoods. And that is why I raised the issue of the SDGs as a very important overall framework, because if we can look at the efficacy, the potential benefits or not of these geoengineering techniques on those SDGs, on the livelihoods, on the health of the people, etc., then I think we have something to show. If we cannot show that, then let's move on, you know.
Okay, and we are now going to move on to a point where someone is going to come and take away some of these microphones and give them to you, the people. I think that's going to happen. Oh, they're already out there. Oh, how wonderful. Okay, could I have slightly more light? We'll go for that question right in the middle.
Yes, my question would be to David. You have noted the disconnect between high-level policy targets, 1.5 degrees, and policy action on the ground. What would be your recommendation to overcome this gap? And could climate engineering play an important role in overcoming that, or should it be other policy instruments and technologies?
Okay, number two, if we get a mic there.
I am Eduardo Viola from the University of Brasilia. My question is for Oliver. Okay, so, I mean, it was kind of surprise for me, the way that you talk about how the German politicians are continuously a hypocritical mindset, and they pretend they are doing significantly, but they are not doing, and they don't want to discuss about solar radiation management. My question is, look, that I am a political scientist. Germany is one of the high quality democracies in the world, okay? It's like with the Scandinavians. So my question is this happening because the political class, the political system is extremely autonomous from the society, but the society is much more aware about the issue and willing to behave correctly, or is because the society actually is also in a hypocritical mindset?
Yes, okay. I had a question about the livelihood issue. How much do we know at this stage about the potential impacts of geoengineering on livelihoods? And so how much do we know? How much do we suspect might be consequences of geoengineering on humans that need further study? And yeah, no, that's it.
Okay, the first question was to David, then there was the question about Germany, which I'd like Oliver and actually Lily to come in on, and then the question about effects on livelihood, which is open to everyone, but obviously especially Lily. David.
That first question was about the gap between ambition and action, and I think geoengineering does nothing useful there. That, to me, is fundamentally about how we reform our politics. Maybe in some circumstances geoengineering helps by kind of realigning the right-left divides, but I think it's a sideshow. I think the big issues there are about finding better ways to talk and listen honestly about the climate problem we face. I have no magic dust there.
Coming to Eduardo's question, I would like to broaden the geographical scope. It's not only about Germany. I would see the same in Western and Northern Europe, at least, and the EU being one of the climate policy leaders. I think in one way the political system is kind of autonomous and is more concerned with proposals than with problems and how they fare on the electoral market, or in Germany on the coalition market. You could see that right now. And I think the experience of politicians is that there is much hypocrisy in the electorate as well. So you will always win elections, or you can win elections or struggles by proposing even more ambitious targets. But if you try to act on them, you might face resistance, and sometimes from the very same people. And there are always things you can, from a government perspective, the experience is you can say and everybody likes it, but if you try to act on it, you get your opposition. Sometimes it's the other way around. And there is one great theory about inconsistency, because we always call on inconsistency and say, well, that's inconsistent, but policymaking is usually inconsistent. Inconsistency between talk, decision, and actions, because policymakers view that as quite independent fields, and they try to address certain stakeholder groups on certain levels. So in Germany, you will win if you have a very progressive talk on climate, and you can even have progressive decisions, but action-wise, you might address other stakeholders. So we see a lot of action in the electricity sector, or in parts of it, in Germany, because that's a big system, and if you don't live near a new power line or a new wind park, you're fine with that. There's a change in the basic fuel of society, in the basement of our economy. If you go into heating, cooling, and transport, you will run into opposition. And that's the daily experience of policymakers in advanced democracies. And that's one reason why they shy away from it. But I think that's not only in Germany. But if German energy transition were about CO2, you would see other kinds of policies. So basically, it's more about renewables versus nuclear in the power sector.
Lily.
Yeah, so on the German question, I guess I would like to just add one aspect where I see a disconnect that contributes to that effect, and which is that for a very long time we have actually not had German civil society demand the necessary from the German government, meaning there was not a large movement of civil society groups in Germany actually saying by when we need to get out of coal in order to reach, for example, 1.5 degree target. But civil society in Germany, and maybe elsewhere as well, tends to already, when formulating their own position, sort of integrate what they expect to be politically realistic. And in order to stay policy relevant and be, respected as a discussion partner with government, they negotiate amongst themselves and water down their own targets, which I think is a big problem. So I'm very happy that is slowly changing, but I want to see a lot more of that. So the first step is we need to start demanding what is necessary so that the government can react to that. On the livelihoods question, so I don't think I'm the most qualified person in this room to answer what we know the models currently say. What the effects of a potential solar geoengineering deployment would mean for livelihoods. I think what we can mainly say is that we know there will be winners and losers, and we cannot exactly say who will be a winner and who will be a loser. The livelihood approach I meant is actually still something different. Just to give one example, it is really going down to the people and where they live and how, and their interdependence with natural ecosystems. So look at forests. So forests are not just carbon sinks, and they're not just feedstocks for power stations. They're places where people live, and these people, forest-dependent people and communities, they protect these forests, and they're actually the most effective way to protect our global forests is by protecting the rights of these forest communities. And that has been proven in many, many cases. So what I mean with the livelihoods perspective is actually to go zoom in and all the way down to these, for example, forest-dependent communities and understand their interlinkedness and their rights and their interests and their history and their cultures around forests before we start talking about the role of forests in addressing climate change.
Very clear. Thank you. Liz, you wanted to add something?
I'm almost afraid to say this, but I've been a politician all my life. So, for much of my professional life, and therefore I want to speak to this issue of policy hypocrisy. No, the farmer is saying, I don't want to have increased water to produce my X crop. And the businessman is saying, I need additional water if I am going to have a return on investment in my business, whatever that business is. And all of the interest groups within the society are putting up an argument for what they need or do not need. And the politician or the policymaker, and I've worked at national policy level for 20 years and worked as Assistant Secretary General of the UN at international policy for a shorter period than that. So I've seen it at both levels. And the politician, therefore, is required to make a decision about quality of life and dignity and all of the issues that you raised in the context of competing multiple demands at the national level, often in circumstances where science is either silent or uncertain or on a timeline that is not running parallel with that of the politician. As a politician, I have a 4-year political cycle or 5-year political cycle, and all of you who vote want the solution or the answer provided or the policy implemented to effect change in your life within my political cycle. And that's what my responsibility is. And let's not get under any illusions. The sole role of a politician, of a political party, is to perpetuate itself in government, in office, full stop. You do that by responding to your multiple constituencies, by attempting to do the best that you can within the context of the knowledge and information that you have. Now let us take this in the context of geoengineering and SRM. You're asking me as a politician to make decisions on the basis of science that is uncertain, for which you don't have any answers, for which you will not have answers for a very long time. I have an election cycle to deal with. I don't have any time for you. And that is the reality. That is the reality of how decisions are made. So when I go to the United Nations to negotiate, I am negotiating against the context of the demands being made in my country on the ground, and I am negotiating in the context of a scientist saying, well, the answer is X or Y because you see it only in black and white and in scientific results and empirical data, and it is going to take you 20 years or 30 years or 40 years to be specific in relation to finding solutions and conclusions for me. I don't have 40 years. In 40 years, I'll be a grandmother watching another politician do the same job or deal with the same issue. And that is always going to be the competing interests in which the scientists and the politician operate. The challenge here, in my view, is that the science community has not framed issues in the context of political realities, in the context of political timelines, and spoken in language to the politician and with the politician that says, here are your options. If you apply option A, this is going to be the consequence. If you apply option B, you can expect this consequence, and then give me what the timelines are for me to make the decision. And unless you do that, you can speak about my ambition or lack of ambition levels at the policy level, and you can't win. Because if we don't set high ambition, you hear that we are without ambition as politicians and we have no political will. And if you set high ambition, then people very articulately say you're so hypocritical because you've got this high ambition level and your actions are not parallel or consistent with the level of ambition that you're articulating. So the poor politician is in a very difficult position.
David, as we've heard, Liz has no time for you. I have about a minute for you before the next round of questions. Use it wisely.
I want to pick up on this question of how well it would work for people's livelihoods. For livelihoods, I think we don't know. But for local climate impacts, we now know something after a decade of serious research. And that something, to me, is very surprising. So we started this research 15 years ago with the assumption that solar geoengineering would do a very bad job regionally, that even if it could do global temperatures, it wouldn't do regional temperatures, let alone precipitation. We're now running the best sort of climate models in the world, which might be wrong, but they are the best in the world. And with my collaborator sitting just behind me, Peter Irvine, for example, we've done that. And for one model, for first of all, temperature extremes in temperature, more than 99.9% of all the little grid points on the land surface get closer to pre-industrial, so the temperature change is reduced. And for precipitation extremes, partly because of tropical cyclones, this is the maximum 5-day precipitation, we can't tell at lots of points because it's not statistically significant, but sort of almost half of them get closer to pre-industrial, less change in extreme events, and only 1% show more change in extreme events. And we can't robustly tell you where that 1% is. We don't know. But that ratio of sort of 1% to 45, I find so good that I'm afraid to publish it because people will think I'm just telling a story about how good geoengineering is. It seems amazing and surprising to me. Much better than I and many people in the scientific community expected it would perform in these models.
Okay, I'm going to take one more quick round of questions, and I'm going to start right at the back there, please. Someone I can barely see right at the back. I should just clarify, we started a little bit late, and so we're going to end a little bit late. We'll then go to that question there, but start off, please.
Okay. I'm a student of the Heritage School of Governance, and I'm wondering if, in the context of political and human realities, if it would not actually be unethical to not put further research into geoengineering, because this really might be what people want, and I think climate change always has to take into consideration as well what is feasible, and feasible is what people want. If there's too much public resistance, we can't make things happen, and climate engineering, I sometimes think, well, you know, people might really be into carbon capturing because it sort of lowers the costs for them now. So if it's feasible, wouldn't it be unethical to not do it?
Thank you. I'm then going to take the question in the middle, and then, yes, I've seen you. You're going to get the last question right in the middle there, but you can go first because you were closer to a microphone.
Hi. So my question is, I guess, 3 in 1. I guess first would be, they're connected. So to what extent is geoengineering actually being considered by countries as a means for meeting their NDCs, since you said it wasn't actually discussed in Paris? And how do, I guess, these discussions compare to discussions around more natural CCS options, so forests or reforestation, that kind of thing? And given these strategies that are clearly cost-effective and have multiple benefits for communities and the environment and are safe, why should geoengineering still be something that is considered by policymakers?
Okay, and the last question.
Okay, so my question is surrounding, I heard Lily mention the 2010 COP decision under the CBD, and I'd like to ask her opinion on how one COP decision from one process, how is that able to be used to influence the COP decision under UNFCCC? For example, she mentioned the moratorium on geoengineering under the CBD process. So how can we use that policy decision to affect change in the UNFCCC policy across COPs? And to Liz, I would want to ask to kind of give me your opinion on solar radiation management and geoengineering, how you see that, and how you see if the Caribbean needs this technology, especially with regards to sustainable livelihoods for small island developing states, not only in the tourism world, basically.
Okay, thanks very much. Liz, I think you've to some extent covered that, but I'd be very happy to hear you speak to that. And Lily, this specific question about the COP, and also the question, who would like to take on the question about how seriously governments are actually taking this? Because I'm asking that because I'm then going to throw the ethics question at everybody. So who would like to take the question about governments taking things seriously? Are you offering to do that, Ola? Okay. Then do it.
I didn't know that I have to start. So in the NDCs, you might find some countries that propose or say we're going to do more on afforestation or reforestation, but all the other carbon dioxide removal technologies you won't find in there. I think there are only 12 to 15 countries who have conventional fossil fuel CCS in there. Even that is missing in the NDC. So you can clearly say they are not taking this seriously. And at least climate diplomats should know about it. And many would say, yeah, it has to be done, but they don't want to be the ones who are doing it. And it might be the case that later on, publics in certain countries might demand something like that. We don't know, and I think that's one of the questions relating to solar geoengineering research. Wouldn't it be better to prepare for such a kind of hypothetical situation that might arise or might not, to invest more in research, because the time may come where we want to know what's in it and what's not in it.
Great, thanks. Lily, this specific question about CBD COPs.
Yeah, so I'm not sure there's any real formal way, and maybe David Cooper sitting somewhere here could answer that, if there's any formal way of how this could be brought into the UNFCCC process. But I think right now the problem we're facing is that even though the CBD has gone through this, process of deliberations and discussions for many, many years and produced lots of documents written by some of the people in this audience, there is very little knowledge in a UNFCCC crowd community bubble about all of this. And I think the first thing we have to do is to start talking about it, and not just pretend that this is ground zero and has not been discussed in international policy fora. I think that is the very first thing we have to do, to bring these discussions and the results from that CBD process, even though they might be imperfect and some points have not been concluded, but bring that into the climate discussion and make sure that these discussions are interconnected. Okay, and then I'm going to ask Liz, there was a question specifically about the government, but I'd also like to just bring us down the panel with that very simple question: is it unethical not to look at this? But Liz, if you can answer the gentleman's first specific question.
I think that the small island developing states need anything which will assist with climate change mitigation or adaptation. Do we need geoengineering? I can't say. There is just not enough empirical evidence that allows us to weight its value or its risks to make a decision about whether it is something that should be deployed or not. It is really too early to say. And until we can get to the point where we know what are the benefits versus what are the risks, then a proper policy, an informed policy decision cannot be taken. So that would be my view at this stage. And there hasn't been a sufficient dialogue, and there's not enough scientific evidence. In relation to your wider question, is it ethical? I think that we have to explore everything. I don't see ethics in terms of black and white issues. Many years ago, it would have been unethical to have neonatal units so that you preserve the life of a premature baby. That would have been thought to have been totally unethical. If God wanted the baby to die when it was 12 weeks old, then let it die. So the ethics and our view of ethics change as technology changes and as technology enables us to do more and more. And in my view, this is just another enabling technology which may or may not help humanity deal with what is an existential issue. However, I think that clear scientific work needs to be done so that, and I go back to the issue, so that we're able to weight the benefits versus the risks, and to whom. Because what may be viable and good for the geopolitical north may not be a good solution for the south. And therefore, how will this impact all humanity so that we can continue to live in dignity or have increased dignity as a result of the application of this science? So that's, to me, the ethics of the issue. Will it allow all of us to be equal members of the human family living in dignity? And that's the core of the issue.
You asked in your question, you used the words, research what people want. And there are many ways in which that is a very problematic thing to try to do. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it, don't get me wrong. On one hand, they should understand what are the choices before they can make an informed decision of whether they want yes or no, or a lot or a little. And how you frame the offer, you should witness some of the conversations that we have with David. Do we call it beautiful language of protection or scary language of imposition? Any choice that you make is going to influence how people react. More importantly, I think there is one thing that is extremely unethical, which is to ask people what they want, to ask an individual, what do you want? And then he tells me, I want to not leave my home even if the hurricane is coming. I'd rather die in my home than leave and whatever. And then I go with armed forces and take him away anyways, because it is my duty to protect him if I am government. I'm not saying that it's unethical to do it. I'm saying that's what I said, but it's not what I should have said. Okay, correction. Thanks for the laugh. You see, we are full of traps here, because once we get answers, we need to know what to do with them. And I think it's very important for us to understand, not only in a research way, but also in an ethical way, how are we going to deal with people telling us something we don't want to hear? Are we going to be willing to no longer have our position once we learn that, guess what, X% of the people don't want what you want? What is the threshold at which the line shall not be crossed? Someone said, in a fellow panelist, why is it so crazy? Well, I really have one prediction that I really trust. It's going to get crazier.
Well, I think it's hard to answer because we're talking implicitly about future scenarios, what kind of world we think might live in 10 or 15 years, and what is the climate policy trajectory and the physical climate trajectory we're on, and we can't answer both with a high level of probability, but I think if I extrapolate the climate policy path and that kind of hypocrisy and that kind of inconsistency between targets and action on the ground, I can imagine us arriving at a state where impacts start mounting even in an industrialized world, and then we see a sudden policy change in how people view these technologies, and that people might demand a quick fix. And that zero emissions within 5 years, even if it were possible, will not be the quick fix. And I think then we will see people being really willing to take risks. And then I would at least like politicians to be able to make an informed decision. But this is based on many ifs to arrive at that question, where I would say, yeah, geoengineering research, solar geoengineering research should be done, and industrialized countries should commit to doing it, but in an inclusive way, because it cannot be that we as the global north are doing it and everybody else should be happy with what we're doing.
David.
I think the underlying strongest basis of concern, reason why there isn't a larger research effort here, is fear of what's often called the moral hazard. Fear that this idea will be misused to argue against emissions cuts. And I think that fear is valid in the sense that I'm sure it will be misused to argue against emissions cuts. But at least as I think through the ethics, I don't see that as a reason to withhold research that could potentially save lives and protect the environment in a really substantial way. So I think medical analogies here are relevant. So we know that some drugs, antibiotic or the AIDS triple cocktail when it first came out, that some people, when those drugs are released, will choose to say have more risky sex or overuse antibiotics, but that is not an ethical basis for withholding the drugs. And I think that's a very clear and consistent finding of how we think about it. So for me anyway, I think that there's a hard to make an ethical case that you shouldn't do research. But I think this has fallen into a trap of talking about the research ethics as if it just depended on the thing being researched. I think it depends very strongly on how the research is done. So I think it would be very unethical of me to work on solar geoengineering research, say, paid for by an oil company who wanted me to exaggerate how well it worked, or unethical to work on it as a weapon. Whereas I do think it's ethical for me or other researchers to work on it, working with people in the environmental community, attempting to be as open and transparent as we can be, and working to make this an international research program that involves people. It can't involve everybody, but involves people as much as possible from a wide range of backgrounds around the world.
I wonder how you can work on it thinking it can only be a climate tool and not a weapon, but that's maybe a discussion we can continue later. I think it would be unethical to pretend that it's a binary choice of geoengineering or climate disaster. And I also think it's crucially important that we do discuss the idea of manipulating and controlling a global thermostat, just like we're doing here. I think that's a crucially important debate because we have the technological capacity to alter our ecosystems at a planetary scale. And this is not just a climate debate. This is also true for modern biotechnology, for example, synthetic biology, and in many similarities. And the House of World Cultures, HKW here, is a place where we have all of these discussions on the Anthropocene. And I think that's crucially important. But based on our great principles and in international law and based on the precautionary principle, I think the ethical choice right now when it comes to researching solar geoengineering is to not allow outdoor experiments or deployment to go forward. That's how we look at it.
Coming back to the original question on the ethics, so is it unethical to not consider it? And I think we have to start by saying it's highly unethical what's happening already in terms of the climate change that our industry, our world has caused. And there are people who are suffering, and a lot of that is resulting from actions by many of us, and that is highly unethical. So then the question arises, is it unethical to do something specific about it? And I think ethics doesn't help us in a binary way, I think you used that word, to say yes or no. It's not that simple, because we have two things that are not good, in a sense that, fossil fuels have caused a lot of good things. We have warm houses, we can drive our cars and do lots of things, produce lots of food, and they have created climate change. So there's some good and some bad. And then we have solutions, potential solutions, like let's say solar geoengineering, where we don't know enough yet, but we know that there's some potential benefits, reducing temperatures, and there's some potential risks that we don't know about. So the ethical analysis doesn't say that this is right and this is wrong. I think the ethical analysis has to depend on a lot more information about what is a more just way to find a solution, for example. That's where the ethical analysis comes in. Not to say that this is right, this is wrong. I think it's too simple. So I think we need more information, we need more facts, and then apply an ethical analysis to those and say, how can we make this better? But we have gone, unfortunately, beyond the time when maybe 30 years ago, if we had applied all the things that the UNFCCC at that time said we should do, we wouldn't be here today. We would have reduced the emissions fast at that time, and maybe we wouldn't have to worry about all these things. But now we are in a situation where we're way beyond that, and maybe we have to at least consider it. So I think that to me is quite important. And one very brief thing on what you said, Lee, on the CBD, I totally agree with you. We need to make these processes talk to each other, but they don't. And you know the CBD has a regular communication to the UNFCCC. When I was part of that secretariat, I was the secretary doing that. And you know what happens? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And there is discussions, but they don't lead anywhere because it's just for the looks. The CBD decision on geoengineering was not consulted with the UNFCCC process, period. So we need to find ways in which these different processes talk to each other in a serious way, and I agree with you, that's what needs to happen. But it has not happened yet, and that's part of the governance discussion we have to have of how to make that happen.
Well, thank you very much, Janis. Thank you very much to all of the panel. Discussion is, of course, the order of the day. I have learned a new word today, and a brilliant word, which is epistemicide. And I can quite see how upsetting it is. I'd like to think that we have been at least partly participating in its corollary process of epistemogenesis tonight. And if not, then maybe we can do so over dinner. So thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you all for your attention as an audience. And that's the end of the evening. Thank you. Goodbye.
That's almost the end of the evening. Somebody still has to thank not only the panelists, but also Oliver for leading us through that deep, multifaceted, and fascinating discussion. So thank you again to all of you. I'd also like to say thanks again to the House of World Cultures, the HKW, for hosting this event and again for partnering with us again this time with the organization of the Climate Engineering Conference. I'd like to say thank you especially to the members of the public who came out to join us this evening, and I hope that you've learned a lot, and I hope that you'll take what you've learned with you and continue to spread what you're understanding about this very complicated and controversial issue.